being here with us tonight, virtually and in person. Yay, in person! Thank you for joining us for a really exciting talk that we have planned. I'm Mariah Hall, and I'm one of the members of the section on preventive medicine and public health here at the college. Tonight, we are all together for Public Health Grand Rounds to talk about funding education as a social determinant of health. So just a little bit about the Philadelphia Public Health Grand Rounds that we do throughout the year. The purpose is to address important public health issues in the Philadelphia region, and we do engage local speakers from multiple disciplines and perspectives to generate new ideas and collaborations to strengthen the public health community. And we always like to thank our co-sponsors, the College of Physicians in Philadelphia, and acknowledge the Independence Foundation. So following the Grand Rounds presentations, please participate in the Q&A session. That's really an exciting time where we can have some interaction with all of you in the audience. So please, as you're hearing the speakers, prepare some questions, and we'd love to hear from you. And don't forget that you can support the section on public health and preventive medicine by becoming a member, and you don't need to be a physician to join the College of Physicians section on public health. Here's your proof right here. And support the section's programs by making a donation here. Follow that link. And just a quick thank you to our institutional sponsors as well for the section. And now I'm going to bring up our wonderful moderator. So tonight, Dr. Priya Mammon will be our moderator, also the chair of the section. So I'm going to turn it over to Priya.
Hello everyone. It is a thrill to see people in person. So thank you for all of you who have joined us in person. Thank you especially to everybody on Zoom for making time for this. I am so excited for this evening for so many reasons, but particularly to hear about this topic and to discuss it with all of you. So I am just going to, before we start with the experts, I'm going to just lay a little bit of groundwork. And the first is really just understanding what it means for education to be considered part of the social determinant of health. So, Healthy People 2020 identified, and I think all of us who are public health experts and advocates know, the foundations of health and wellness have been identified as things external to physical self. And those are these large systemic things that hit all of us. The Healthy People 2030, this has now been 2010, 2030, identified education as one of the social determinants of health, and you can see here there are others: healthcare access and quality, which is one that most of us recognize, neighborhoods and built environment, social and community context, economic stability, and of course, education access and quality. So in Healthy People 2030, one of the goals is to increase educational opportunities to help children and adolescents do well in school. The question then becomes, what is it about doing well in school, but also just educational opportunities that has an impact on health and wellness? Putting together the latest data, they found, and it has been widely recognized, that high-quality early education programs increase earning potential and encourage and support educational attainment. Quality education in elementary school is necessary to reinforce these early childhood interventions and to prevent their positive effects from fading over time. Overall research shows that school quality has an impact on both short and long-term educational attainment of children, as well as their health. And specifically, children who enroll in low-quality schools with limited health resources, safety concerns, and low teacher support are more likely to have poor physical and mental health. We've just picked out some of the studies that sort of show the bullet points. There is a ton of data that supports these ideas, but I'm just going to show you a few. A study done in Public Health Reports was actually a review of, a literature review of all of the studies prior to that, based on the WHO and CDC guidelines on what constitutes social determinant. This report found that the physical and structural environment of schools, the health policies around schools, health programs through schools, health resources available in schools, the school climate and school composition all had a significant impact on social determinants of health and ongoing health and wellness of the children. The study in science showed that early childhood investment did substantially boost adult health. And specifically, one of the largest studies is the ABC study that actually started in the 70s, which was a randomized control study that randomized young children born of the cohort between 1974 and 1977 to either usual services or early childhood programs. They found overall that being part of these early childhood programs had a statistically significant impact on reducing crime, raising earnings, and promoting education. This study in science took a look at the same cohort to look at long-term effects on health and wellness. And what they found was that there was a significantly lower prevalence of risk factors, specifically for cardiovascular disease, mainly in blood pressure and cholesterol levels, as well as metabolic disease. And this was especially strong for males. So in addition to the crime and earning potential, there was actually physical impact. So finally, I'm going to show you this study that was done with funding from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The study mapping the link between life expectancy and educational opportunities looked at the country in assessing teens in neighborhoods with high levels of educational opportunity versus teens in neighborhoods with educational opportunity. They identified high levels and low levels of educational opportunity. And the way they identify that is based on these factors. So there's effective teaching, which predominantly looked at teachers and their skill level and experience level. Rigorous academics, which looked at the kinds of courses offered and the kinds of enrollment offered. And then supportive conditions for learning, things like lost suspensions, things like out-of-school suspensions and chronic absentees, as well as non-academic support. So the number of students for each student counselor, the school nurse situation, the psychologists available, and the social workers. So I zoned in on our area. Basically, very quickly, there is a lack of information or just not as much information from Philadelphia in terms of specific life expectancies. So no data from South Philly and from parts of these areas. But overall, life expectancy is less than 76. You can see pockets where it's higher. Center City is highest. Orange, these colors, red and orange, are the lowest caliber of educational opportunities. And that, if you look at Philadelphia, seems to be the vast majority. If you look out into the suburbs, there are more variation, but higher proportion of high school educational opportunities, and dark black, which is highest level of life expectancy. This study actually mapped pretty much the entire country through a set of zones, and the findings held everywhere they looked. So I'm now going to turn it over to our experts. We have a phenomenal panel of experts who are going to break down the different aspects of disparities in education, and what we're focusing on is how it is funded. As a focus on looking at access to high quality and resources, there are plenty of different ways to break down the discussion, but really what we're looking at is how educational systems are funded to promote equity and to allow for inclusion. Overall, to improve all of those health metrics. So first, we will have Ms. Ashley Giles Perkins. Ms. Giles Perkins is part of the Philadelphia Office of Educational Law Center, and she's also an Independence Foundation Public Interest Law Fellow. Oh, we have like a Venn diagram. Ashley's work centers on addressing the significant educational injustices for youth involved in child welfare and juvenile justice systems in the Philadelphia area who enter, reside, and leave residential facilities. Ashley provides representation of students and families, trainings for families and communities, and significant outreach to stakeholders to ensure oversight, accountability, and access to quality education for system-involved youth. Ashley graduated with a JD from Loyola University Chicago School of Law with a certificate in Child and Family Law, as well as a master's in Education and Cultural Educational Policy Studies from Loyola Chicago School of Education. While at Loyola, Ashley interned with Advocates for Children of New York and Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, and she served as a research assistant to the law school dean. She's originally from Bridgeport, Connecticut. So without further ado, I introduce Ms. Ashley Giles-Perkins.
Hi, good evening, everyone. We do not have that much time, so I'll just jump right in. The cost of going without, connecting inadequate school funding with the school-to-prison pipeline. I will be skipping some of my slides. I also tend to not read the slides, so for those of you that can listen and read all at once, kudos to you all. And for others, I am available to share my slides and also talk more about the Education Law Center, which I will say is a statewide nonprofit and ensuring that all children in Pennsylvania have access to a quality public education. And as you just heard through my fellowship and also through Education Law Center, we do focus on students that are particularly underserved, students experiencing homelessness, our English language learners, students with disabilities, my particular fellowship, students that are system involved, are in foster care or juvenile justice systems. We also, of course, have other priority areas and statewide work. So just briefly about my fellowship, thank you for the introduction, that was a great cover. And so I'll just skip to one particular for those that are able to see the graphic. When I was coming to Pennsylvania from Chicago and researching some of these issues, I stumbled upon a report, Unsafe and Uneducated, co-authored by the Education Law Center, and learned that majority, really overwhelming, if not nearly all, students that were in juvenile justice placements did not and were unable to get GEDs or even high school diplomas. Just 9% of those students in this study, and just 2% were able to go on to attend college, not graduate, not matriculate, but just to enroll into college. And so I asked myself, where are the other 98%? Diving in, the school-to-prison pipeline, it is a pathway that leads students to being introduced into the justice system, which ultimately leads to incarceration. The culmination really of individual decisions and school policies transforms school discipline into school push-out. We see everyday administrative decisions and choices of teachers and individuals lead to systemic issues that can have long-lasting consequences, particularly zero-tolerance policies and other, even minor school-related infractions can lead to law enforcement referrals. Across the country, really just some background, we do find that suspensions are going up, they're increasing. This is even in light of what I've seen during the pandemic. We have virtual suspensions where students are excluded from their cyber classrooms. We also see on the back end that majority of those that are incarcerated in state and federal systems do not have high school diplomas. So at some point there is a very severe breakdown in who's in the classroom and who becomes incarcerated. And as many of us may already know, there is a disproportionality of Black students, particularly Black boys, and even really Black boys with a disability. Whereas the IDEA, students served under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we see just about 13% of the population, but nearly 27% are referred to law enforcement. This is consistent and honestly worse in Pennsylvania. Again, we see student that is most at risk of out-of-school suspension or arrest is a Black male student with a disability. So unlike the national data, those three categories or identifiers were separate. In Pennsylvania, we see single-handedly Black male students with disabilities being the most at risk of being excluded from school. Their rate of arrest is actually 6 times that of all other student groups combined. So think of white girls, Asian boys, Latino boys, Black girls, all the other students combined, it does not, doesn't even come close. Black students also tend to have a greater likelihood of receiving out-of-school suspension, higher arrest rates. The arrest rate for Black students in general is 4 times that of white students. Pennsylvania actually has the 3rd highest arrest rate of students in the country. This is increasing over time. And jumping down, Pennsylvania is 2nd in the nation for arrest of Latino and Black students. So what happens after that is a lot of different things. Alternative schools, hospitals, residential treatment facilities, cyber programs, juvenile detention centers, placement into residential settings. This often leads to more tracking of families, sometimes students becoming further involved in the system. We also sometimes lose those students. They go nowhere, they drop out, and we don't know what happens to them. What is common is that education is typically limited in these settings, and this further impacts lifelong outcomes, students' ability to earn credit, to graduate, to be successful, to get careers. These are all things, decisions that were made on a school side that then lead to these juvenile justice consequences. So really moving into funding, right, connecting the dots. We see that Pennsylvania funds schools as a state about 38%. We see that majority of our funds do come from the federal government, and that very little come from other sources. So really majority we have are property taxes. This is important, and for those who are already aware, the Education Law Center's Fair Funding Trial, us along with Public Interest Law Center and Pro Bono Counsel from the O'Melveny firm brought a lawsuit against a number of respondents, state actors responsible for providing education across the Commonwealth. These were our petitioners, our 6 school districts. We have also NAACP as a petitioner, the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools, a number of parent plaintiffs as well from these districts. This funding trial essentially wanted 3 things: acknowledgement, revisions, and maintenance of a new system. So declaring that the current system of funding our schools, which is primarily, as we saw, through property taxes, is unconstitutional. Ordered the legislature to cease using this inadequate funding scheme, and further ordered the legislature to create and maintain a funding system that would enable all students to meet state standards and reach success. Connecting this back is further what students need is a high quality public education and making sure that they can have it regardless of their zip code. So breaking this down even further, zooming in a bit, what we have is an example. So I have here New Hope Salisbury School District and Reading School District. We have the mill rate, so the rate at which wealth is taxed is 12.6 mill rate. This is able to yield about $25,000 per child. This is again local. We have the state contributing about $4,600, and total state and local funding per pupil about $30,000. We have Reading, where the tax rate is more than double. However, this doesn't yield more than double the results. It yields about 10%. Local revenue per child, $2,500. State revenue is higher here, but it's not proportional, right? Because what we end up with is state and local per child spending is $13,000. That is a difference of almost $17,000 per child. So when we have these situations, we can see that the state does give more money, but it's nowhere near enough to close the gap. Further, it's not necessarily enough to level the playing field. These inequities have stemmed for decades. The underfunding, as I will talk about later, is about $4.6 billion of our education system. So just some examples. I don't know exactly, but I may be preaching to the choir about what we see across the state and in our schools. This picture is a photo from Lancaster School District, and we have some examples from trials. So just 2 reading specialists for 1,200 students, no math specialists in the building at all. We see our kindergarten classes with 30 students and just 1 adult. We have some courses in schools where there are no AP courses, crumbling infrastructure, classrooms without heat, classrooms without air conditioning. And then in one example, this is turning into not just a funding issue, but also what our students are able to achieve. So in one example, we have high school students taking their PSSAs, Keystone exams. They're scoring 6% proficient as a school. And just 4 miles away, in a wealthier district, we see almost 95% proficiency. These differences in resources have long-term consequences. It impacts funding, it impacts who wants to live in that district and send their children to those schools. It also impacts the students themselves, not having enough and being expected to perform with less. And as we see, again, the cost of going without. So just some other examples, and I will keep moving. Outdated textbooks, limited course offerings, insufficient services for English language learners, if any services. There are sometimes schools where there is no translator. There aren't documents that families can actually understand and participate with. We see difficulty hiring and keeping. When the district, going back to the example, is paying you less to do more, and just a few miles away, you can have many more resources and a higher salary. The choice is sometimes clear. I won't say clear in the sense that that's what you should do, but that's what we're seeing. Just speaking from Philadelphia in particular, who is not a petitioner in the case, my clients now that still do not have nurses in their schools, transportation to get to school, guidance counselors, these issues continue, and as we even saw with the pandemic, districts that were able to pivot overnight to online learning and virtual learning, districts that had computers and they had their technology, they had trainings, and schools that weren't even able to provide laptops until the following school year. There is a formula enacted in 2016. The formula should be distributing increases in state funding based on weighted students. Weighted briefly just meaning taking into account who is being served and what their needs are, and that some needs are greater than others. There are factors into not just how the pie should be split, just kind of resource shifting. What it really should be asking is how large the pie needs to be based on need. What we're seeing now is about 14% of funding that actually goes through the fair funding formula. Really emphasizing that money does matter. All students are capable of learning. Poverty, when unmitigated, has significant impact on child development and student achievement. Students living in poverty, as some studies we just heard about, can achieve at high levels when provided with the proper supports. One particular expert testimony that I'd like to highlight is from the economist Dr. Barnett of the National Institute for Early Educational Research, testified that providing rich early learning opportunities to children who otherwise would not have them in those first 5 years, we can substantially alter the pattern of beginning school far behind and staying behind. Currently across the Commonwealth in our economically disadvantaged zip codes and in neighborhoods, just 60%, actually 40% of students are being served, students that need early learning and preschool. So 60% of economically disadvantaged students are in the term going without. one piece that I did want to highlight is a lot of the funding starts at the onset. It starts at the beginning with the property taxes and local wealth. Actually, 91% of the economic disparities can be explained just at that very outset. So I'm running close on time, but really just identifying the long-term problems. Having a goal of fully funding schools and what does that look like. There has not yet been a time where Pennsylvania has undergone the necessary and really systemic wide-sweeping reforms that would be necessary, and that is something that we do hope to see at the conclusion of the trial. I can answer some questions in particular later, but really the state legislature should be determining the needs and providing those resources in a consistent manner. A lot of the times we have grants or one-off funding, particularly COVID funds that came in. Those sort of budgets are not sustainable. If a superintendent or a principal made a decision to offer another kindergarten class so that the class could be maybe not 30 students for 1 year, there's no guarantee that they would be able to do that the following year. So really consistent funding is important. And studies do show that funding losses have some long-term impact about revenue being raised that otherwise would not be raised. So, much more to say, but thank you.
Winter Ray Snyder is a mother, historian, educator, and organizer rooted in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They received their PhD from UCLA, from where their doctoral research focused on methods of historical reconstruction and the politics of representation and narrative ensured within histories of enslavement and abolition in the Americas. They design and teach courses across history, Africana studies, and gender studies. And in all their professional work, they support others in moving towards personal empowerment and collective power. They currently are an organizer with the Education Justice Campaign pilots, payment in lieu of taxes with the Philadelphia Revenue Project, and our City, Our Schools Coalition. In 2021, they founded the Accountable History Network, a worker-owned co-op that focuses on cultivating community accountability at the crossroads of historical reckoning and relational healing. Their first book on Haitian sovereignty, land ownership, and rural methodologies for understanding the past is under contract with the University of Florida Press.
Thank you for that introduction. Good evening. I'm grateful for the invitation to be here with all of you this evening. Thank you so much to the organizers for all your work and for holding this container. I'm here to approach this topic through the lens of education justice as it manifests in our shared community as Philadelphians, people who love, work, and live in the city and call it home. So often when we talk about funding in the city, we invisibilize the ways that our own decisions and priorities continually reproduce historical conditions of inequity. The lens I bring to this conversation is informed specifically by the Coalitional Organizing for Pilots, which, as Priya said, stands for Payments in Lieu of Taxes, which I'll address a little bit further on, and by decades of others organizing for education justice as fundamentally also a fight for the wholeness and well-being in our city, centering the experiences and the demands of folk who are directly impacted by chronic underfunding and the literally toxic conditions it produces in our schools. I count myself lucky to be among the students, teachers, parents, school staff, and administrators who continue this fight, and I would like to shout out the Our City, Our Schools Coalition and the Philly Revenue Project for holding this work in the present with excellence. So I'll begin with an overview. We already heard a lot about this from Ashley. I'm so appreciative of your whole presentation. But I'm going to begin also with an overview of how funding makes its way into our school district. In recent years, the school district of Philadelphia has been forced to rely more and more on local revenue. You may recall that in 2011 to 2013, Philly's public schools experienced a massive funding crisis that resulted in mass school closings and layoffs, not only of educators, but also of nurses and other vital support staff. This particular crisis came from the state level when the then Governor Corbett changed the way that funding is allocated between school districts across the state, Philadelphia was hit particularly hard, along with other districts that serve primarily low-income students of color like Reading and Allentown. With such unreliable funding from the state, you would imagine that we would want to bolster the amount of funding that schools receive on a local level. But that hasn't been the case here. Over time, we have systemically stripped down our local tax base to the bare bones, both through corporate tax breaks and through nonprofit tax exemption. As you can see, Philadelphia loses out on more revenue due to corporate tax breaks than any other school district in the entire country. A study from 2019 found that Philadelphia lost out on $112 million in revenue, against which even the second highest number pales in comparison. Corporate tax breaks in the city have been used as a way to keep Philly, quote, open for business, and they are always enacted in the name of so-called community. And I want to note that we're all using the same words to talk about what we're doing, and it's really important to unpack. But these breaks have reciprocal impacts on our neighborhoods and in the city, especially Black and brown neighborhoods who have experienced historical violence, marginalization, and disinvestment over time. When any of us cites community, it is important to look closely at the sinews of what we mean. In this case, one man's treasure is another's disinvestment. Finally, this brings us to tax-exempted land. Due to the school district's dependency on local revenue, I want to share this slide showing the huge amount of nonprofit tax-exempt land in Philadelphia. Locally, tax revenue for the school district mostly comes from property taxes. Property taxes broadly pay for public schools and other essential services that are also vital to community health, such as public libraries, rec centers, etc. It's difficult to get more recent numbers on how Philly compares to other cities, for me in this moment. But as this slide does show, this has been a long-standing issue here in Philly. As recently as 2019, there were nearly 23,000 properties in Philadelphia that were exempt from paying property taxes because they are owned by nonprofit or government institutions. In total, the $29.6 billion value of all exempted properties accounts for 17% of the city's total real estate value, according to the Inquirer. That's about $414 million annually that the city is losing out on for essential services. And a huge chunk of that revenue would have gone to the school district if it had been fully taxed. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I want to ask, or I want to say, who are these mega nonprofits? Who are these nonprofits that are owning all of this tax-exempt land? Who am I referencing? And in short, it's us. Philadelphia has an extraordinary amount of nonprofit tax-exempt land, much of which is owned by multi-million or even multi-billion-dollar nonprofits. However, the service-providing nonprofits that we typically think of when we hear the word charity or benefit, public benefit, aren't responsible for the vast majority of nonprofit tax exemption. Instead, huge nonprofits like Penn, Drexel, and Jefferson make up the lion's share of this exemption. These institutions that we are affiliated, and I'll speak for myself, that I am affiliated with, are supposed to represent public benefit, but recent scholarship and advocacy by people in and outside of the ivory tower and the world of the nonprofit industrial complex have pointed out how our institutions must also thrive off of profit to survive. And in order to do so, we must collude with bigger forces, like, for example, the real estate development in general in the city, that reproduces systemic inequity by viewing the city not as a place of shared community and mutuality, but as a site for the extraction of wealth. Chronic underfunding in our schools that leads to both literally and figuratively toxic conditions in our communities is a deeply historical and structural issue. There is not one institution or individual in this city who does not participate in it in some way. Even though we would rather not acknowledge that these are the ties that bind us, even though power and privilege thrive on silence and erasure, this is truly the weave of the fabric of our community, the body of our community. I say this as a way to call us into the recognition that what we do now matters, and that it is not only possible but imperative to shape a future that grants access to equity, healthy and non-toxic places to learn and play for all Philadelphians. I organized for pilots, again, payments in lieu of taxes, because they are an intermediate structural solution to a structural problem, and it's important that our solutions be structural in nature. Payments in lieu of taxes are voluntary agreements entered into by mega nonprofits and the city government in recognition that the benefit provided to the city is not commensurate with the revenue generated by the institution for itself. Our demand in the pilot's campaign is for every wealthy nonprofit to pay 40% of the property taxes that it would pay if they weren't exempt. It's important that solutions be structural, like I said, rather than revolve around select services, which was also mentioned, or these are called silence, services in lieu of taxes. And I want to go down this rabbit hole a little bit for a second, because when we hear that there are conditions of inequity and structural violence, a lot of our first impulse is to rush in with these select services. So I'm going to list a few examples of what a service in lieu of taxes would be as opposed to payment in lieu of taxes. One example is that in November 2020, Penn pledged $100 million over the next 10 years to remediate lead and asbestos in Philly public schools. This was a huge win and a big step forward in our vision of full accountability for mega nonprofits, but that's not structural change. It doesn't actually address the way that Penn makes money and extracts money. Penn also recently announced a gift to the Samuel Lee School, or Lee Elementary, also in West Philly, mirroring its investment in Penn Alexander as a school. And this is where they pledge a certain amount of money per student over a period of time. And it's led to, at Penn Alexander, really, the flowering of a much more comprehensive and quality education. This is also similar to Drexel's engagement and growing engagement with Powell Elementary, also in West Philly. And universities often tout examples of these services as a way to show that they're working against inequity or working against this violence that we've outlined. But in fact, pouring resources into one school or another school actually exacerbates conditions that are driving long-term residents, especially Black, brown, poor, and working class residents, out of the city. So even in Lee's catchment area, for example, since the announcement of Penn's investment, property value has soared in that catchment, as it did with Penn Alexander, which is then leading to the displacement of long-term Black and brown residents. So these solutions, or silence, aren't addressing the problem at its root. Pilots, on the other hand, is an attempt to do that. It's not the end-all and be-all solution, but it is something that we can do now, and it's something that we can push for now, instead of passing the buck to Harrisburg, which is a whole different ballgame and very difficult work, as I understand. So comparing pilots and silence, individual tutoring services, for example, versus Penn making a payment of 40% of what it would be owing in its property taxes are like comparing apples and oranges. It's a both-and situation. You can have investment via services and also have pilots, but most places, most mega nonprofits will tell you that that's not possible. Often, as I've outlined, providing these services, universities like Penn, Drexel, and Jefferson end up bolstering their own reputations for civic engagement and community service, in addition to being the actual recipients of funding. In reality, we remain as power brokers with enormous overhead. And no amount of services can amount to the transformative effect that equitable school funding could have on the well-being of our communities. I want to invite us to think about schools as sites of transformation. They can be sites of the continuation of power dynamics, or sites that can be used in the perpetuation of power dynamics that we have seen historically, or they could be sites for seeding different futures for our city. In closing, I hope that this shows that there is a pattern baked into the history of public school funding in Pennsylvania and in Philadelphia specifically. Resources are hoarded by corporations, wealthy white school districts, and by wealthy nonprofits like Drexel, where I teach. If we want to create conditions for growing a beautiful future for all Philadelphians, we have to not only start now, but we have to go back to account for how we are entangled in the roots of chronic underfunding themselves. Thank you.
And again, thank you so much, Winter. So we've just had a look at state level and city level, and we are moving forward. Our next speaker, Simran Sidhu, she is a doer and also now has the sort of angel funder perspective. So Ms. Simran Sidhu is the Executive Vice President of Impact for Spring Point Partners, a Philadelphia-based social impact organization that invests in the transformative leaders, networks, and solutions that power community change and advance justice. Her leadership ensures Spring Point Partners' impact work is integrated, nimble, and equity-focused, while empowering community practitioners to take risks within an infrastructure of accountability. After serving as a grant writer for Youth Build Philadelphia Charter School, she rose to the role of executive director and saw the organization through 15 years of significant growth, tripling its budget. This was her past life. This is why she's so unique. Under Simran's leadership in Philadelphia and as president of the National Directors Council for Youth Build USA, the organization grew to have a national reach, helping more than 3,000 high school dropouts earn diplomas and become successful community members through education, job skills, and environmental support. In 2017, she took the helm in building the Hive, one of inaugural impact programs of Spring Point Partners, and today oversees the breadth of the organization's grant-making and impact investment from youth development to animal welfare, centering equity and justice throughout. Offering the unique perspective of a former practitioner, Simran is committed to matching partners with the best mix of tools they need to success. In recognizing that social impact work is often paradoxical, she eagerly grapples with philanthropy's eons-old dichotomies, balancing the smart stewardship of funds with meaningful impact for communities in Philadelphia and nationwide.
Hi, everyone. I have to admit, I wanted you to stop at the first line because no one has ever used the word angel when introducing me of any kind, so it was a good thing. But, so I am here really, I do work at Spring Point Partners and focus on a whole bunch of areas of impact, including in education and in adolescent youth development. But I am really here today because I had the glorious and amazing privilege of leading an organization that worked with some of the best young people. And it's actually a strange parallel to how my dad talks about what I do, because I haven't worked there in 6 or so years, and when asked what I do, he still says, she used to run a really great school, and that's it. So it's good to be here representing that work. But, and I am here partly to talk about what it meant to be a practitioner in that space and what I witnessed in immersing myself and looking from the inside out at all the incredible potential that we were wasting, frankly, but also the labels and tags and all of this stuff that we use in the context of our young people. And so, you know, the connection between sort of education funding, public health outcomes, we've heard a whole bunch about. I have some data actually that is stolen from the Education Law Center's website that, you know, talks even more about sort of how mortality rates are literally decreasing for every additional year of schooling that people have, that graduating from high school improves the quality of health, reduces dependence on public health programs, sometimes by 60% in various studies, that there's a national savings in public health costs that would exceed $40 billion if every high school dropout in just a single year would graduate in any given year. And so I think we should be really worried about the connection between these systems and how we are failing in so many of them. But I'm going to start
with a story of my first year that I was executive director at Youth Build and raising money, as one does, for young people. And so we were doing this usual thing that we do in our programs, which is have 10 young people sit in a circle, and had some lovely funders who were coming there to visit with our young people. And one of the lovely questions that everybody invariably asked, and our young people answered, is like, why did you drop out of high school, and what have you learned? And to a person, the 10 young, amazing people in the room took turns and sort of told a story of, I was just a bad kid, I just didn't like school, and so I was acting out, or I got involved in drugs, and I had, just such deep stories of ownership and this thing that they had done, and how now they could see the importance of education, and Youth Build had helped them so much, and their career was more tracked, and because Youth Build as a model did this comprehensive academic as well as job training model, and you could get a career certification as you worked to rebuild a house in the city. And so they gave all these answers about why they had dropped out and took ownership for it. And a little bit later into the meeting, one of the funders, who is a woman in her 40s, said, don't mind me if I look a little bit down and emotional. I lost my mom last month, and that's still sort of playing out for me. And one of the Youth Build students said, with such incredible empathy, oh my gosh, I had that happen to me. Let me give you a hug. That happened to me in 9th grade too. It is one of the hardest things, but it gets easier. You have to remember the good stuff they taught you. And then another student chimed in and said, I lost my grandma who I lived with when I was in 10th grade. I know what that feels like. And all of them started chiming in with this, and the funder was, so touched and said to me, wow, I was just not expecting that level of empathy. And I was in a panic, because I was like thinking, oh my God, 8 out of 10 said this, but they didn't connect it to what happened. And so later we reached out and we sort of said to the students, hey, so you talked about your mom in 9th grade, so what happened? And they had not connected that they had stopped going to school because they were in grief, and nobody reached out. Nobody said, why did you stop showing up? And they were self-medicating because nobody was helping them. And so, it gave us a whole different perspective very early on, that while for funders we were using the language of dropout, really we were talking about pushed out, ignored out, backdoored out, all kinds of out, and that this system had very seriously made sort of some choices along the way, but we were in crazy crisis, and here were young people who were sort of the victims of this, who were taking all of the accountability on. We were expecting them to be grateful for a second chance. And that sort of was a defining perspective for why we raised money, what we did. So, in recent times, there is a lot that we now know about adolescent brain science and how young people are wired, and education science and trauma science, and we understand, here are young people, They are hardwired. They're doing their biological imperative work in taking risks, in not caring what the adults in their lives think, but caring about their peer group, because guess what? That's who's going to see them through the rest of their lives. They are actually learning to leap out of their childhood into adulthood. It is its own beautiful, incredible phase, with its own incredible development, with its own imperatives. And we look at them and we say, okay, we know, we read all these books about how that is happening, and yet we will punish you really severely in all of our systems for doing the thing that you are designed to do in this phase. And we will force you to go get basic services, like basic things that you need at this stage, from 50 different systems, and then blame you for not showing up, even though we know that there is no teenager who's going to go to 6 different appointments with 6 different things and do these things, right? We will punish you and call you no-shows and do all this stuff across all of these systems. And we decided that we were going to try and integrate systems. And so Priya talked about that increase in fundraising capacity. Well, it hardly happened because we just believed that our young people were worth it. Even those numbers, like we should do the pilots, we should do all those things, but then we should be willing to spend even more. Because it becomes worth it when you start to see the picture a little bit differently. So as we started to get that funding, we had this sort of gnarly programmatic moment in our program where staff were walking around saying, I know when I'm filling out these 500 forms for counseling, and I have to fill out like work service hours, and I'm doing vocation training hours, and this has become about grants, and we don't really do this for students, and what the heck is happening in this program? And so we stopped in our tracks and kind of said, all right, well, what is happening here? And they were like, there's all this grant funding coming in, and it's wonderful that our ratios of students to adults have reduced greatly. I think at one point it was 4 to 1, which is what I think we need across our systems. But we're just consumed with all of the wrong things, and the metrics are overtaking our lives. And so we had this retreat where we said, fine, forget it. I'm sick of fighting everyone. We throw it out. What do you really want? Like, what do you really care? When you look at XYZ student, what are you concerned with? And the answer from staff was, we really care about the 35-year-old that he's going to be. And I was like, great, what do you want for that 35-year-old? We want him to be healthy. We want him to be thriving. We want him to own a home. We want him to be a great father, a loving husband. We want him to feel loved. We want him to be fantastic. What does that mean for when he's 25? Well, then he'd need to do this, he'd need to finish this, he'd need to have done that. Great. What does it mean for when he's 1 year outside of our program? Well, clearly we need to be very connected to this kind of program, a vocation program, college, all of these things. Fabulous. What do we need to do by graduation? What do we need to do first day that he ever experiences us? And how do we integrate all of those things? And the paperwork is back office infrastructure, it's systems noise. Yes, we need to fill it out correctly because nobody wants to get arrested by the federal government, which, by the way, is crazy that you have to think of these things when you're running a school, but you do if you're trying to get funded because the systems don't integrate at all. At one point, we filled out 11 different databases, some of which track student hours of participation. But on the front end of it, students got to experience walking into a place that did not have metal detectors because you got hugged when you came in, and a place where you could go to a case manager, and the case manager talked to your teacher, so they knew why you were missing class if you had to for some reason, where someone always came with you if you were going to court because it mattered, where someone was with you when you were going on a college visit and representing you, where there was interconnected systems. And by the way, our outcomes were fabulous on national service hours, on case management, on all of these things. And people would come in, and the criticism and pushback would often be, well, but you're kind of an expensive program. And we were not. We were actually the cheapest effective case management program. We were the cheapest education program. We were the cheapest vocational program. We were the cheapest, transition to college program. We were just doing it all in one place, centered and integrated around young people. And that's what was working, is that they were at the center of these systems. And so my sort of appeal to everyone who's like funding out of systems, figure out how to make all this sync up. And it's, you know, in some ways easier said than done, but it's amazing to me where we are willing to spend money and where we don't, and how we need to like lean into all these places and say, of course it makes sense for us to exist together, but students shouldn't have to like exit one system and enter another one just to get services that they've identified. And it would be great if we could do these things. And it's not just about pool funding, because honestly, the individual funding, not only do we not integrate systems, but then we underfund every one of those systems. And so how do we both increase funding and then integrate that funding so that for young people, they're seeing seamless services, because that's what they need. And my other sort of big appeal to all systems who touch young people at all is to really develop some discipline around this idea of being adolescent-friendly. Like, we have child-friendly practices in early childhood, we know to lock drawers and do all these things, but we don't think about what do young people actually need at this stage. How do we provide guardrails and bumper cars, but not such punitive, crazy consequences that we are shattering their lives every time they take a little risk. And so this includes little things like figuring out school timing. It has been like a God knows how many year fight to move high school timing to 9 o'clock when we have known that this makes a difference, that their circadian rhythms need to study later. And sometimes, like, if you go into actually the simplest thing, for years, we used to have staff meetings at 3 o'clock. And we said, oh, maybe we should have staff meetings at 8 and let students come later. So like Mondays and Fridays, we changed that, and it made a difference because we could do simple things to do it. And I think even now within systems, there has to be a way of saying, are we meeting the needs of who we're supposed to serve? Those are little things in some ways, but big things, but there are a couple of very, very massive things right now that I think we absolutely have to do. One of those is mental health and health services in schools. Like, we are going through an epidemic right now, and if those systems are not talking, it is insane. I mean, a reported rate of like conservatively 45% experiencing mental health issues in school, and very, very few getting those services. And it is a great point, I imagine, to identify early prevention and strategies and identification of these things, but we are just not using that system at all. And so it is being entirely unidentified. We're doing lots of stopgap things. We fund emergency helplines and things like that, but it is impossible to do these things when your ratios are like 400 to 1 on counselors, and you're expected to help all the seniors get their college applications and everything else done as well. And then the final thing, actually, Ashley talked about the consequences of this a great deal, but like, we just can't have such punitive measures where we know, like, they are, anyone, I have a 20-year-old, 16-year-old, and like, there is a magical part to the slight flipping off that every young person is doing for us, that we need to be able to appreciate and give room for. Like, they need to have voice and choice in order to safely do those things. We know that at this stage, those identity markers and your feelings of respect and self-respect and who respects whom are highly charged. How do we create an environment that actually honors all of that stuff instead of having it meet and sort of come slamming into such severe consequences that, frankly, I mean, I honestly think the consequences in the juvenile and justice system are so severe that we can't look at it. I think we blink because it is unbearable to think of. The capriciousness and the craziness of that system and what we are willing to have young people experience because they did very little, frankly. Like, they are looking after themselves, they're looking after their own safety needs, they're experimenting a little bit, and we are punishing them in ways that almost guarantee long-term terrible consequences. And we have to find ways, and there are, every study that works at diversion in a serious way, including the one in Philadelphia, which I think just by not having students who have brought sort of some contraband into school be arrested, we're reducing recidivism greatly, and not having them touch that system we know has great health implications. Could we start doing that in more serious ways? Thanks very much.
Having a practitioner give frontline information is always so key, and I appreciate all of your efforts and your work. So we are rounding out this discussion with Dr. Sarah Goldrick-Robb. Dr. Goldrick-Robb is Professor of Sociology and Medicine at Temple University and President and founder of the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice in Philadelphia. She is also the Chief Strategy Officer for Emergency Aid at Equity, a student financial success and emergency aid company, and founded wellbeing Students, a nonprofit distributing emergency aid. Dr. Goldrick-Robb's innovative research on students' basic needs sparked the national Real College movement, #RealCollegeMovement, and legislation to address food and housing insecurity. Ranked in the top 10 among education scholars according to Education Week, she is also a Carnegie Fellow. In 2016, Politico magazine named her one of the top 50 people shaping American politics. Sarah's book, Paying the Price, College Costs, Financial Aid, and Betrayal of the American Dream, was featured on The Daily Show with Trevor Noah and awarded the $100,000 Grawemeyer Prize, apologies if I mispronounced that, which she donated to student emergency aid. Dr. Goldrick-Robb is going to take us to the next step of education, which is higher ed.
Thank you so much. It's not an easy thing to follow Simran, but I think you'll see I'm passionate about the topic, and I am grateful to have the full setup that you all have provided as we've thought about the implications of education for health throughout the life course, starting when one is very young. I am now going to move us to thinking about the role of education at the post-secondary level, by which I mean anything that happens after high school. I'm not just talking about bachelor's degrees. One of the most robust findings from science over many, many decades is that any years of education after high school seem to bring substantial returns to one's health. That includes a two-year degree, for example, from a community college. It even includes going for a one-year certificate program. We don't precisely understand all the reasons why this is the case. It could be, for example, that just knowing more things, spending more time in school around people who think about things like science pays off, right? It could be that people who go to college earn more money, and then having more money allows you to secure more health care, right? And that in turn pays off. It could also be things like we know that people who go to college tend to marry and start families with other people who also go to college, and that living in more highly educated households together can actually bring health-bearing consequences. There's a million different reasons why this could be, but the fact is that the relationship is there, and it is one of many, many reasons that people across this community and across communities across our whole nation and our world put so much money into trying to go to college. Right? If we want to talk about something expensive, college would probably be at the top of the list, and it's odd to be talking about this on a day when the President of the United States is coming once again to terms with what student debt has meant to the country, and talking about it as potential for debt relief, talking about it in terms of returns to the economy. He should be talking about it in returns to our health. So the thinking, and I'm a sociologist by training, the sociologists like to talk about this as the potential for a very virtuous cycle. In other words, people who are healthier manage to get more education, which in turn helps them become healthier over time. They have children who are healthier, they go on to more education, and around we go again. Another way to think about that is privilege begets privilege. Another way to think about that is lack of privilege is very sticky. Right? If you don't break out, if your lack of good health prevents you from getting further education, as it does for children all over the city, then that cycle is no longer there for you. One of the things that I learned upon moving to Philadelphia and becoming a parent of public school students, two of whom are sitting over there, is that apparently the thinking in this city, if your child doesn't go to school, the thinking is that maybe you as a parent just didn't know it was important for them to go to school. So they robocall us and call us and text us and call us and text us. Your child is not in school. Why are they doing that? Well, they're doing that because they believe that we need to be told that our children should go to school. But the leading cause of school absence in this city is not parents who didn't know that school was important. Does anyone know what it is? I'm not on the panel. It's asthma. It's asthma. And why is it asthma? It's asthma because this is the poorest large city in the nation. And housing conditions, our educational conditions, our health conditions. And we have bad housing stock as homes to so many people. So, when we say that students aren't finishing high school, they're also not going to college. It doesn't have to be that way. This is a system that is unique among systems in the world, in that if you did not go to college at 18, you do have opportunities to do so later in this country. It's very different, for example, in Germany. We prize the German system, we talk about the German system being more affordable, being very high quality, but for the most part, if you didn't go right out of high school, you're not going. But we've set up an entire set of second chances. They're called our nation's community colleges. We have one in this city that our children are not encouraged in their schools to attend, which is rather remarkable because it represents a single best second chance when we don't get things right in the first place. So in order for higher education to play that role, part of that virtuous cycle and promote health, a couple of things have to happen. One, people have to have access. Right? You gotta be able to get in. And we have a culture that prides itself on raising children and parents going off to Friday night dinners and then telling each other stories of how their kid beat the odds and was the one out of the 100 that got into that one school. Because somehow we've decided that the lower the number that they've admitted, the better the school must be. We didn't want to lose other people in the club, so we're going to a better club. I call these highly rejected colleges. Okay? So you can't go to those schools unless you can get in. But if you can get into those schools, they offer the lowest prices. Now here's where the panel's going to go back in a circle. So if you're a low-income student making $30,000 or less a year as your family income in this city, what is the most affordable college for you to attend? Does anyone know? Just give me a guess. Most affordable school to attend? Penn. The average price for a low-income student at Penn, if you were of traditional age coming right out of high school, not if you were 24 or 25, because Penn is not for you. That's practically what the policy says. The average price is under $1,000 a year. Under $1,000. Of course, the problem is that the people who most need that price are the least likely to be able to get into Penn. They are the most likely to be going to the Community College of Philadelphia, which actually, on a per-student basis relative to family income, is the most expensive college in the city of Philadelphia. A lot of people talk lately about community college being free. There's a program at CCP called the Cato Scholarship. The city talks a lot about it being free. The cost of going to college includes tuition, fees, books, supplies, housing. It includes health care. It includes clothing. It includes the ability to do your laundry. All in, the price of a year of community college in Philadelphia right now for the lowest income students is over $12,000 a year for somebody with no estimated ability to pay at all. So the forces that are determining that, who gets to go where and what price they pay, those forces, which include wealth inequality and structural racism, render that virtuous cycle of health promoting education essentially moot. Because the people who are likely to go and likely to finish are already the healthiest. The people who would be most boosted in terms of their life chances, literally their life chances, years of additional life, lower rates of diabetes, lower rates of hypertension, less heart disease. Those people don't get access to college, and if they do, they don't get to stay very long. How do we do this? Well, if you thought the K-12 system funding was complicated, you should see how much more complicated we do it in higher ed, because we do a mix. We do a mix of what states pay and localities pay and what the feds pay, and then we have this elaborate voucher system. And the liberals like it. It's called the Pell Grant. Maybe some of you went to college on the Pell Grant. Pell Grant was created by Milton Friedman, the architect of the K-12 voucher as well. Milton Friedman thought, we shouldn't make colleges free. What we should do is we should give the low-income people a special voucher to get a discount on the price. They'll take it to any college that they want, and those colleges will give them good prices in exchange for their vouchers. That is how we will do accountability. And as a result, we were told that anybody attending a public 2-year or 4-year college in the entire United States of America would get 100% of their costs covered. The Pell Grant today, sometimes I compare it to like a Groupon, right? Tell me, I mean seriously, if I said to you, hey, you want to go with me to Vetri? We got a Groupon, and it's 15% off. And you're like, yeah, we can afford Vetri now, right? Except, by the way, when you actually get there, you find out it's not even 15%. That was a mistake. It's 1.5%. And you find that out after you've already eaten dinner. These students are ending up there with this tiny coupon that just gave them the reason to enter the door, the belief that they could, and now just invites them to debt. And to make it even more fun, despite what the public believes is told, the limits on what you can borrow for college is actually really low. You have to turn to private lenders if you want enough money to actually make up the gap. So what you have is students who are going to college on the Pell Grant, also maxing their federal loans, also working multiple jobs, and still can't make ends meet. Which brings me to the punchline of the last 20 years of my life, which is that college is literally creating poverty. And an estimated 1 in 2 undergraduates experiences food and or housing insecurity while in college. Not because they grew up poor, but because college is actually making things worse. We also do that by declaring those things that promote your health, things like housing, food, mental health services. We declare these things non-academic expenses in higher education, with about as much hubris as we can muster. There's a teacher in this city who would say, you know what, yeah, we can do K-12 education, we can do elementary school, we don't need that free lunch program. I mean, look at this city. We don't even do free lunch now on an individual basis, it's community-wide because it's that essential. They couldn't do it without it. We would never pretend like you can separate whether a child has had lunch from whether a child can take a test in the afternoon. But the minute that they go to higher education, we say, you don't need that program, and we take it away. And then we say, if they're asleep in the classroom, it's not that they haven't eaten, it's that they're not college material. Now I could trace that through 100 different systems and processes where we actually take the real numbers that really reveal the students' actual health needs for these funds and disappear them, which allows schools like Penn and others that claim to meet full need to look like they're doing so even as their students are actually not okay. So there are homeless students at Penn as we speak. There are homeless students at Amherst. There are homeless students at Yale. You cannot find me a college in the country where they do not exist now. The segregation of funding that was described earlier is so egregious in higher education. If it was K-12, the state constitutions would preclude it and there would be lawsuits. But what they're doing in K-12 is at least actionable. In higher ed is actually just considered good practice because it's all about deservedness. The students who have performed the best in high school performed the best largely because their parents also went to college and knew how to help them to get into college, are lavished. The per pupil expenditures quoted earlier, I could blow your minds. Amherst proudly proclaims on its website that its per student spending per year per student for people who got some of the highest test scores in the nation, right, is $100,000 a year. The per student spending at the Community College of Philadelphia is $7,000 a year. And lest you think, well, Amherst can do whatever it wants because that's private money, it's not private money. These are your federal and state tax dollars at work, and these are the tax exemptions that they benefit from. A study done in New Jersey showed that there is more public subsidy and direct dollar support from the government going to Princeton University than to the New Jersey community colleges combined. So the effective prices are highest at the places where the students can least afford them and where the students are dealing with the biggest pre-existing health conditions. So the result is that higher education is literally compromising health. It is not adding value for the vast majority at this point. We have the widespread basic needs insecurity. We have increasingly high dropout rates. Some numbers just came out today that showed that the percentage of students who renewed their FAFSAs, their financial aid forms, these bureaucratic nightmares, the percentage who actually renewed it for the next year, which means they're continuing in college, just dropped precipitously. That means they're leaving. And just to be very clear, when you drop out of college these days, 9 times out of 10, you're doing it with debt, but no degree. So the minute that that student loan pause ends, and it will end, if he doesn't wipe that debt, these students are going to have to contend with rent and child care and everything else on a low-wage job without a college degree and be repaying the debt for the education that they did not get. And we know what goes by the wayside when that happens. Their food, their need for any sort of mental health supports, and so on. I don't think I need to explain, given everything that you've heard earlier, who this hits the hardest. This hits the hardest of the communities who were never even envisioned to be in higher education. Higher education was not built for the people they are now excluding. Virtually none of our institutions will say with a straight face they're up to the task. We are accomplishing exactly what the system is designed to accomplish, which is to allow a very small number of only the wealthiest people to extract the benefits. And this is happening at precisely the moment when college has become non-optional. So as you think about that, especially during Q&A, I just want you to think about what happens then to those 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds who walk into our buildings, who look up and see the pennants from the different colleges hung there, and they say things like Drexel or they say things like Penn. I walked into my daughter's class at Meredith Elementary School a few years ago and said, "Where are y'all going to college?" And what did they tell me? They named schools they saw on TV because of basketball tournaments and where their moms and dads had gone. not one of them named the Community College of Philadelphia. They're on a track there is very little chance they will afford, and the cost of them actually trying to pay for it could send them literally backwards. So that's my story. Thank you all so much for having me.
I need to take a breath. That is a tremendous amount of information. I will just say, I looked up at one point, and the sign of just amazing speakers is that every time there's a new speaker, everybody else was writing. And that's the idea of constantly learning and constantly getting new ideas from colleagues and peers is really one of the driving forces behind public health grand rounds. So we now open it up to discussion and questions from the audience, both live and virtual. The way all of the discussion was organized was really from the state level to the local level to the frontline level, and then the goal, what so many of us kind of believe to be the goal, which is advanced degree. At what point do you feel that at this moment in time, so Biden's having his discussions right this second, they have been going on longer than some of us have anticipated and hoped. But at what point in the trajectory do you feel like it's the most opportune time to act? Is it on the state level? Is it on the federal level? Is it on the local level? I personally am, I'm a student of, the student that bowed in front of Jeremy Nowak, and one of his sayings has become this sort of mantra of my life is power belongs to the problem solvers, and overall, the problem solvers are now most often gathered at the community level. But where do you see the opportunity to kind of interject and stop this cycle?
I almost can't pick. My work a lot of the time is school to prison pipeline based, and I see on the ground local issues and how sometimes there's local control, but at some point it goes up to the state, and at some point hands are tied and budgets are tied, and there's only so much we can do to kind of push around the pennies. So I want to say it's at a higher level, but I think we've seen initiatives that are supposed to trickle down and they just don't. So I'm fine to say I'm not sure.
I was going to say, in response to that most of the spaces that I'm in are student-led organizing spaces or community organizing spaces. And so the time is always right now or in the past, right? Especially when we're looking at racialized spatial patterns in the city and how they structure the distribution of funding and all of the health and education impacts we've all been talking about. I think that what I gleaned from that is that student-led organizing, community organizing that offers a framework for continuously being in community is a way to center the experiences and needs of young people, as my co-panelists were talking about, and to continually center them in all of our efforts to providing more equity via funding, via services, and all of these things. So I feel like the time is always now and always moving forward, but it always must be centered on the experiences of folks who are directly impacted.
I think you're right in sort of saying like power should be with the problem solvers and where they are. However, in order for that to happen, there has to be some ceding of power too. And I think that is difficult. And I also think like we have to take, as complicated as it is, these are false choices. And so there's a part of me that is also movement oriented, and I understand that we need the folks who are quietly sitting with policy papers in rooms in front of people that they do not want to be in front of, and the folks who are screaming and saying, take it all down, because nothing happens without someone screaming. We don't listen. And so I just think that in some ways, what we need more than ever is great translators of within those movements, and people who can broker power differently, have some people cede power, give it around in different places, and see the system as well as the individual, and know that it's sort of on fire a little bit. Like, you can't work only at the pace that we have been, so there's a need for both that push and pull in the moment.
Yeah, I would underline that. I mean, I think that if we're going to undergo a global pandemic, we ought to get something out of it. I mean, you don't let a crisis like this go, and frankly, it yielded some decent science. So one of the things that's sitting right in front of us that I am astonished that I don't hear more people talking about is with regard to the child tax credit. You know, we put something in place that was decades in the making. Rosa DeLaura of Connecticut worked very hard to get that there. We did it. We didn't do it perfectly. We should have planned for it in a little bit of a different way so that it would be more sustainable. But the science is incredibly clear that it was very worth doing. Addressing child poverty would help in numerous ways here, including that these children would grow up to, there'd be bigger tax bases, right, and the overarching thing would be better. I think we have to be shouting that from the rooftops in every possible place, including in rural communities that are really struggling to feed their kids right now and have a lot of misinformation coming at them about what the best ways are out of that. So I think you have to have those conversations locally, and you have to have those conversations at the state level, and you have to have those conversations at the federal level. And we have more than enough people in this country, if everybody got engaged, to pick your place that you're happy with, and still be a lot louder than we are, and frankly, to leverage both science and to leverage this idea that we don't want to do this again, right? I mean, this public health crisis that we are in right now was utterly and completely predictable in so many ways, and our struggle to get out of it is related in so many ways to everything that we've said here today. So, again, carpe diem.
Excellent. Any brave souls from the audience? Yes.
So, as a victim of the student debt crisis, I would like to thank you for calling it out as an issue, because that is 100% what it is. And hearing the talks of student loan forgiveness is very nice to hear. But my concern is that it will stop there, and we'll just have another generation dealing with that after I get with my life. I'd like to know maybe what thoughts you might have on how we can actually handle the problem instead of pushing it back 3 years.
Yes, thank you for that. I'm really glad that you said that, because I'm not in favor of a full force cancellation without any addressing to any prevention plan, right? Actually, one of my fears about doing a full force cancellation is that essentially we'll be satisfied, and that the political noise will die down, and we will have done nothing about preventing the next piece. So in my bio, you heard, I still don't understand how it happened, but this political magazine award that I won was because of my work on free college. And it predates when Obama first started to come out and talk about free college. The fact is, actually, we made a really critical mistake about 60 years ago, and all we need to do is go reverse it. There was, as I noted earlier, there was a debate, and it was led in large part by Milton Friedman and a set of other economists over whether to fund institutions or to fund students. And they, in the spirit of lot of distrust at the time around our institutions of higher education, partly because of the Vietnam War. They thought, let's not give the money to the institutions. Let's give the money to the consumer. And there was a reason why that was so convenient. It was convenient because it opened up the marketplace of higher education to business interests even further than it has already been. It helped grow the student loan market, but it also helped prop up for-profit colleges. You know, I'm sure many of you watch the Super Bowl. My kids know what happens during the Super Bowl when the commercial for the University of Phoenix comes on, because I literally rise up and start shouting. Those are your tax dollars, to be clear, okay? At a for-profit college that is drowning parents in debt and giving them degrees with no value. We just have to, it is not that, frankly, the issue is that the people who run our government right now largely went to private institutions or to state flagships that very much do not want to become government schools, with all the loaded jargon of what we did to K-12 schools, frankly, around that, okay? If we could decide that we actually just really cared about the outcomes, that public higher education needed to be a good, viable option, and we put our dollars there first, we could make it free tomorrow. We would do it by cutting off the private schools. I just want to be clear, that is the choice. Second, if there is money left over, and there very well could be, there could be returns to this with higher college attainment and greater tax dollars that would allow us to then start to make the private schools affordable, we could go there next. But the dollars possessed by places like the Pennsylvania community colleges versus the dollars possessed by the lobbyists at places like Penn, or even Franklin and Marshall, or Drexel, or any of the others, we don't stand a chance. So these are the choices. And to be clear, I'm not just talking about covering tuition and fees. I'm talking about being able to afford your living expenses with much less expensive on-campus or nearby campus housing. I'm talking about expanding the National School Lunch Program to higher education, making it possible for college students to qualify for SNAP if they need it, which are currently excluded from in so many ways, right? And the ability to actually work on campus in a job that is related to your education that pays a decent wage so that you can work at one job and not 10 jobs. It is all absolutely doable. We just have to push for the actual conversation to happen.
Thank you for that question. Yes?
Philadelphia is getting a new superintendent of schools. I'm wondering if the system is so institutionalized that we cannot really have much of an impact, or you feel that he is bringing something that we can put into
The question is whether so there was recently a search for a new superintendent of the Philadelphia School District, and there has been a candidate that's been selected and who has been vetted by a bunch of different community organizations. And I would say that, and the question is really whether these dynamics are so baked in that getting a new superintendent would make any difference, right? I think in the question of the equitable distribution of funding within the school district, what we were looking for in the vetting process was a sense of real accountability to community, a sense of responsiveness to community organizing, and an ability to not only listen to, but then take action on behalf of communities and folks who are directly impacted by, for example, toxic building conditions. So I think that the next superintendent will obviously have a very ossified structure to work within, and we'll have to combat the ways that the school district has been shaped by the last 20 years or so in particular. But I think that there can be shifts that he will be able to make once he is there.
Yes.
concern with using property taxes to pay for education. Is there an idea that you have that tax property tax throughout a station tool and divide it? Like, if it's not going to be funded that way, how, what is it, equitable way that you see funding happening?
summarizing the question is, if we essentially, what would be the plan if local property taxes are creating some of this inequality? What would be a solution to that? And one of the main pieces, at least through the funding trial, is that we've seen essentially districts pitted against one another. And if you're getting more, we're getting less kind of mentality. And one of the ways, at least around that, would be to have an equitable funding system that focuses on need. And quite to be a little bit frank, there are districts that just have exorbitant amounts of wealth, and they are districts that, you know, every year they cut more and more. We have obligations that increase, and even when you're technically on paper getting more funding, that money is going towards obligations, pensions, maintaining the school building, maintaining salaries, and all of those other pieces, and you don't actually see the dollars impacting students in the classroom. And speaking further about the students in the classroom, needing to focus on need. I did touch on it, I couldn't go into a deep dive, but there are students that they're not being served with the budgets that we have. So I do think that ordering the legislature to do a costing out study, something that has not been done for, is it a decade, is it more? To assess need. What are the needs? How can we fund something if we don't know what it costs? So that's really a starting point. Some of the studies will say as much as $4.6 billion is being underfunded, and that is per year, every year. And so when we're seeing investments, historical investments of $1.5 billion, that's amazing, but it's not doing enough to close the gap. I think some really rethinking of how we fund schools needs to still happen, and further discussion is needed.
I also just wanted to respond really briefly to say that I think at the statewide level, we can't wait for there to be a precedent that's established in Harrisburg. Rather, what we can do is try to work with a citywide framework that instead of like investing in individual schools, if folks are paying pilots, that would be distributed across all of the schools in the district, right? So I just wanted to add that piece in as we're working with different scales.
Well, I'll have a question here, and we actually answered a good chunk of virtual questions already. But so this one I think would be interesting. It says, at what point do we stop advocating for increased federal and state funding instead of holding institutions accountable to lower costs? I'll share my view of the question.
I'll take that one. All right, listen. When do we start holding the institutions accountable for lowering costs? So here's the interesting thing. This is a talking point that has been popularized for decades, that educational institutions are wasteful, that they simply are spending more money. If they would just control their spending, we'd be in better shape. That narrative has its origins actually in the rhetoric of Ronald Reagan. It's been remarkably successful. It's a very similar narrative to one that has been woven about low-income people and moms, and particularly black moms as well. There is very little evidence that educational costs at any level are inflated. If anything, we see that only in places like the ones I referenced earlier, places like Amherst, which honestly one could ask, what is it you need to spend $100,000 a year on when somebody has already come in with all of these advantages? These are social cohesion activities, let's put it that way. But if you look at the actual cost information and the dollars that they are operating with, today's schools at all levels are operating with fewer dollars on a per student basis to educate students who have more needs, not less. That actually, though, is one of the most important things that we all need to teach each other, because it is so easy to look at the rising price of tuition, for example, and assume that tells you they're just overspending. That's not what tuition is. Tuition is the number that's being passed on to you as the consumer consumer. It is not the cost. Right? So the reason tuition is up so much in Pennsylvania is because, in all of its infinite wisdom, the Pennsylvania legislature decided that this generation's students should pay a larger share of their expenses than their parents have paid. It doesn't mean that there's more dollars on a per-student basis going towards things like instruction. In fact, it's the opposite, which is why we have so few faculty who have full-time positions or benefits or any of those things. And it's why, we heard a ratio earlier around advising. In most of our higher education institutions, there's about 1 advisor to 800 students. You wonder why people get bad advice. You get what you pay for.
I think that is a very powerful way to close the discussion. I think, so, just to try and wrap it up, a very complex discussion and just masterfully provided to us by these experts. I think we all have to acknowledge that these are very complex issues, these are complex and very difficult discussions, and in some way or other, all of us are implicit and perhaps even complicit. We sit right this second in a space that is nonprofit, that is, if you just look around, historically been of a predominant group. And to try and automatically change everything to be equitable is a pipe dream, but it is the systematic, ever-forward progress and steps and education and awareness that all of these experts here bring, and all of us in the audience, I think, are really champions of. The very first step is to be aware and to understand and to call the problems out where they are. And I think that has been what our rules were for public health grand rounds, for this panel in particular, and for all of you in our audience, both in person and online. So I thank you all for taking the time to share with us, to sharing your expertise, especially our panelists. I can't thank you enough. This is the last public health grand rounds of this fiscal year. We'll start them again in September. So I'll take the opportunity to thank the tremendous team. We have Ms. Mariah Hall in the back. Dr. Kate Fox is online. Jessica Lynn, who has been all the doer for getting all the pieces in place. Rachel, who is our events coordinator, and the team in the back who helps all of our tech. Thank you so much.